Hi, it's Neil here. Welcome back. And we are up to chapter 7. Yes, you got it. We're into a new hexagon, and that is investigating fraud, theft acts, concealment, and conversion. Let's get into this week, shall we? Investigating theft acts. Now, the big picture is that we have moved up this pyramid. Remember, you should invest in fraud prevention, but we know most companies fail to optimize at that level. And that's, if we're a consultant, we need to give them advice to really put in that culture of honesty, that tone at the top, to work on eliminating fraud opportunities. Okay, but organizations are not there yet. We know, because fraud is still happening. All right, now we go to fraud detection, and fraud is being detected. And we looked at that in the last 2 weeks in chapters 5 and chapter 6. Now we're moving to fraud investigation, and things are getting more expensive now. All right, you have detected fraud. Now we've got to talk about and think about how we're going to investigate fraud. So in this chapter, chapter 7, we are looking at theft investigation methods. Yes, this is stuff out of the movies. You'll see as you get into this textbook. Developing a vulnerability chart, theft act investigation methods, which include surveillance, invigilation, physical evidence, and electronic evidence. So where does this chapter fit into the bigger picture of investigations? Well, we're at the top of this diamond over here, theft investigation methods, chapter 7. Chapter 8 looks at concealment investigation methods. Chapter 9 looks at conversion investigative methods. And then chapter 10 looks at inquiry investigative methods. Now, there's a pyramid here, but there's sort of 1, 2, 3, 4. So what do? Well, let's put inquiry in the middle here. So as you go through the slides and as you go through these weeks, and maybe each of these modules, chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10, we may have to combine into just 2 weeks rather than spread out over 4 weeks. We may not have time to spend 1 week per chapter. Let's see how we go this semester. But for now, just keep this pyramid in mind as we go through these 4 modules. The learning objectives for chapter 7 is to understand the various ways frauds are investigated and when to use each investigation method. Discuss theft investigation methods. Understand how to coordinate an investigation using a vulnerability chart. Describe the nature of surveillance and covert operations. Understand the effectiveness of invigilation. Explain how to obtain physical evidence, and also how we can seize and analyze electronic information. Yes, there's much more of that going on these days, and even most audits are now gone beyond the sampling stage, using IT to get 100% information on transactions in the organization. Let's start with the case study at the beginning of chapter 7. And that was this monopoly fraud where McDonald's contracted with Simon Marketing, and Jerome Jacobson was the key person, and he was in charge of organizing the placement of prizes around the country, and hopefully it was going to be random. And so then when people come in the McDonald's store, they buy different products, they would discover and find that they have received a prize. Well, Jerome had this idea of, I know where the prize is going to be. Why? Because I'm in charge of placing the prizes. So why don't I conspire with friends, other people, to give me $50,000 on average each, and I will give them the actual prize and then coach them to explain how they received that prize so McDonald's would not know the better. So how many times did he do this? He did this 17 times, on average $50,000 each. So that's a lot of money. That's nearly $1 million that he got in kickbacks. Of course, he gave out lots of millions of dollars in prizes from McDonald's, but it was found out. How was it found out? Well, you know, from the last 2 weeks, it starts with fraud symptoms. You know that. Fraud symptom. The informant tipped to FBI, and then the FBI started an investigation. And this is where they started tapping phones. Yes, you cannot do that, but the FBI can. And suspects were followed. And in the end, they were able to gather evidence to convict Jerome Jacobson of this massive fraud undertaken on McDonald's monopoly. So do read through that. As you can see, there's a symptom from chapter 5 and an investigation, phone taps, wow, stuff out of the movies. And that's what we're looking at in this module, how the investigation should be undertaken once fraud symptoms have been found out. Of course, understanding that McDonald's outsourced to Simon Marketing could have combined with this fraud symptom that is an informant and really help convince FBI that they do have a likely fraud on their hands to begin the investigation. Wow. All right. So deciding when to investigate, that is the big question. There's transaction costs involved if you investigate. There are transaction costs involved if you don't. The implications are that if you go ahead, then you may risk public exposure, reputation loss. If you don't, it may give a bad signal to insiders, to other employees in the organization, and it may damage that tone at the top. It may damage that honesty culture that you are trying to create in the organization. You need to think about the perceived factors, the strength of the predication. I think this is a key word that all of you need to remember. Predication is that sense that fraud has occurred, but you need to get more evidence. But predication starts off with a symptom plus something else. And then suddenly we have predication here. We know that this symptom, this tip is real. But remember, you cannot bring a tip into court as evidence on its own. You need to get evidence. So the in between the symptom and the investigation is this predication, that belief that fraud has occurred. So predication, keep that word in mind. Okay, so this is the decision areas you need to go through in determining whether you investigate or not. What to do next? Well, beginning an investigation is you don't go and tell the world. You don't go and tell everyone in the organization. Certainly do not go and tell suspected people on your suspected fraud list. All right, few people as possible. Avoid words as investigation. Maybe use the words of an audit, or we're just doing some checking and internal control overhaul or something like that. As the inquiry proceeds, the investigative methods work from outwards, where you looked at personnel records, different records. Then you start to interview former employees or people outside the organization, unsuccessful vendors, if you're looking at supplier kickbacks, for example. Then you may search public records, invigilation or surveillance. You may interview other buyers, and then you might interview the suspect. And you only interview the suspect when you have some evidence. You have the evidence that really is enough to take the suspect to court. But of course, ultimately, you want to get the suspect to sign a confession before you go to the police, before you go to court. That's the ideal scenario. Okay. So we want to develop a vulnerability chart. And this is where you lay out, this is kind of like an investigation strategy. And I've circled 3 boxes here that I think are the starting point of a vulnerability chart. Rather than saying, oh, look at all these, they're all equally important. No, it probably starts with the symptoms. Remember, Learning Module 5, Chapter 5, Chapter 6. It also starts with possibly assets missing, the fact that you're not making a profit, the fact that inventory doesn't reconcile, the fact that there's something strange in accounts receivable, the growth doesn't match with the growth in sales. There may be some weakness in the internal controls. And these are all signals of the vulnerability of the organization to fraud. Remember, weak internal controls is a symptom as well. All right. Then you can expand your strategy to start to think about, okay, we're pretty sure we've got a predication here. Now we need to think, okay, who's on our suspect list? And which of these suspects most likely had the opportunity to do the theft? Which of these suspects are likely to more rationalize? Which of these suspects are likely to be able to conceal? How can they conceal? And also, which of these suspects are under more pressure? And then we can start to think about conversion possibilities. And then we can start to think about, well, how are we going to go about the investigation? Wow. So there's kind of like a sequence you could go through here, even though in the textbook, they kind of throw it all together into something like this, starting right across from left and going all the way to right. It's not necessarily you come over here and then you start there. In some ways, you might even start with symptoms, all right, out of learning module 5. You may think about the assets that were moved, what was taken. Then you can start to think of your suspect list and start to fill in other parts associated with the vulnerability chart. This is basically your investigative strategy, and it is so critical that you lay this out, get as much information as possible, maybe talking with maybe 1 or 2 people at the most in the organization that you know are totally separated from this fraud that is predicated, that is alleged to have occurred.